They said I had no jewels for the ball, and for years I believed them. But on the night I entered the Duke of Ravenswood's glittering hall, wearing the sapphires given to me by a king, I learned that dignity cannot be stripped away by cruelty. It can only be surrendered, and I had never surrendered mine. I remember the cold. That is what stays with me most vividly when I think of the years I spent in Lady Pemberton's house. The relentless, seeping cold that crept through the thin walls of my attic room, that settled into my bones during the long winter nights when the fire in my grate was never lit because coal was too precious to waste on someone like me. I would lie beneath my threadbare blanket, watching my breath form clouds in the darkness, and I would think of my mother. I would think of the way she used to tuck me into bed in our old house, the grand estate where I was born, where fires roared in every hearth and the smell of lavender sachets perfumed my pillows. I would think of her hands, soft and warm, smoothing my hair back from my forehead. "Sleep well, my darling," she would whisper. "Tomorrow holds such promise." But tomorrow had held only loss. Loss upon loss, until I could scarcely remember what it felt like to possess anything at all. My name is Eleanor Ashworth, and I was born the daughter of the Earl of Whitmore, a man whose lineage stretched back 3 centuries and whose love for me was as vast and unconditional as the sky. My mother, Catherine, was renowned throughout London for her beauty and her kindness, and my childhood was gilded with every comfort imaginable. We had carriages and servants, silks and jewels, summer holidays in the countryside, and winters filled with balls and music and laughter. I was raised to believe that I would marry well, that I would take my place among the finest families in England, that my future was as secure as the stone walls of our ancestral home. I was raised, in other words, to believe in a world that no longer exists. Our estate, Whitmore Hall, stood on a gentle rise overlooking a valley of emerald green, its stone walls mellowed by centuries of sun and rain. I knew every corner of that house, the library where my father read to me on winter evenings, the music room where my mother played Chopin as twilight softened the windows, the rose garden where I learned to walk, toddling between the fragrant bushes while my nurse hovered anxiously nearby. The servants had watched me grow from infancy, and they loved me as if I were their own. Cook would slip me warm biscuits from the kitchen. Thomas the footman taught me to whistle, much to my mother's gentle dismay. Mrs. Pemberley, the housekeeper, let me help her count the linens, making me feel important and grown. I thought it would last forever. Children always do. The fall came swiftly. My father, for all his noble blood, had no head for finances, and when I was 17, we learned that he had trusted the wrong men with our fortune. A business partner named Silas Blackwood, no relation to the Duke who would later change my life, had convinced my father to invest heavily in a shipping venture that promised extraordinary returns. For 2 years, the dividends arrived regularly, building my father's confidence and encouraging him to invest more. By the time the scheme collapsed, my father had committed nearly everything we had. The partner vanished. The ships had never existed. The entire enterprise had been an elaborate fraud, and my gentle, trusting father had been its perfect victim. I remember the day the truth emerged. I came down to breakfast to find my mother weeping at the table, her face buried in her hands, while my father stood at the window staring out at nothing. The letter from the solicitor lay on the table between them, its official seal like a wound. I picked it up and read it, though my hands trembled so badly the words blurred before my eyes. It was all gone. The investments, the savings, the properties that had been mortgaged to fund the fatal venture. We were ruined. The creditors came like wolves, circling closer with each passing month, until there was nothing left to give them. I watched my mother sell her jewelry piece by piece. First the lesser pieces, the small earrings and simple brooches that held more sentimental than monetary value. Then the finer items, the diamond bracelet my father had given her on their wedding day, the pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother, the ruby ring she wore every day of my childhood. Each sale carved another line into her face, But she never complained. She simply squared her shoulders and carried on, because that is what women of our class were taught to do. The servants departed one by one, and each departure felt like losing a member of our family. Cook was the last to go. She embraced me in the kitchen, her ample arms holding me tight, and she whispered in my ear, "You are stronger than you know, Miss Eleanor. Do not let them break you." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat, and I watched her walk down the drive with her single bag of possessions, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The furniture disappeared from rooms that grew emptier and colder with each season. The paintings came down from the walls. The rugs were rolled up and carried away. The china and silver that had been in our family for generations went to auction. I helped my mother wrap each piece in cloth, pretending not to notice when tears slipped down her cheeks. By the time I was 19, we had lost the estate. Whitmore Hall was sold to a merchant who had made his fortune in textiles, a man who had never set foot in the house but who planned to use it as a summer retreat. I stood at the gate on the day we left, looking back at the only home I had ever known, and I felt something crack inside my chest. A piece of my heart would remain there forever, I knew, buried in the rose garden, floating through the empty rooms, waiting for me to return. But I never did return, and I never will. We had lost everything. My father did not survive the shame, the weight of what he had done, the trust he had betrayed, the security he had destroyed, the family he had failed, crushed him slowly but inexorably. He stopped eating. He stopped speaking. He would sit for hours in the cramped parlor of our rented lodgings, staring at a wall, his eyes empty and his hands trembling. The physician came and went, shaking his head and murmuring about nervous collapse and melancholy of the spirit, but we all knew the truth. My father was dying of guilt. He took to his bed one autumn evening when the leaves were falling gold and crimson outside our window. I sat beside him through the night, holding his cold hand in mine, listening to his labored breathing. Somewhere around midnight, he opened his eyes and looked at me with sudden clarity. "Forgive me," he whispered. His voice was so faint I had to lean close to hear him. "Eleanor, my darling girl, forgive me for what I have done to you." "There is nothing to forgive," I said, though my heart was breaking. "You did what you thought was right. You were deceived." His eyes filled with tears. "I have taken everything from you," he said. "Your home, your future, your prospects. I have left you with nothing." "You have left me with your love," I told him, "and that is worth more than any fortune." He smiled then, a ghost of the warm, gentle smile I remembered from my childhood. "My brave girl," he murmured. "My brave, beautiful girl, you will survive this. I know you will. You have your mother's strength." Those were the last words he ever spoke to me. He slipped away before dawn, his hand still clasped in mine, and I did not weep. I had no tears left. I had used them all in the months of watching him fade, and now there was only a vast, hollow emptiness where my heart had been. My mother followed him into the grave within the year. She never recovered from losing him. They had been married for 23 years, and in all that time I never once saw them exchange a harsh word. Theirs was a love story, quiet and enduring, and when he died, she simply stopped living. She went through the motions, rising, dressing, eating, speaking, but the light behind her eyes was gone. She was waiting, I realized, waiting to join him. She caught a chill in early spring, and it settled in her lungs and refused to leave. I nursed her as I had nursed my father, sitting beside her bed through the long nights, bathing her forehead with cool cloths, trying desperately to make her eat. But she had no interest in recovery. She had no interest in anything except the promise of seeing my father again. On the last night, she took my hand and pressed something into it. I looked down and saw a small velvet box, worn with age but carefully preserved. "Hide this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Tell no one. They are your future, Eleanor. They are your proof that you were loved, that you mattered. I opened the box, and the sapphires blazed up at me like captured stars. The king's gift. I had almost forgotten about it, buried as it was under years of loss and grief. But here it was, the most valuable thing my mother had managed to save, protected through all the months of selling and surrendering. "Guard them," she said. "Promise me." "I promise," I told her. "Mother, please, you must rest. You must get better." She smiled, and it was the saddest smile I had ever seen. "I am tired. My darling," she said, "so very tired. But you must not be sad. I am going to see your father. I am going home." She closed her eyes, and her breathing slowed, and by morning she was gone. I stood alone at their funerals, a girl of 20 with no money, no prospects, and no family willing to claim her. The few distant relatives who remained had made it clear that they wanted nothing to do with the disgraced Ashworth family. The friends who had once filled our drawing room and praised my mother's beauty and my father's generosity were conspicuously absent. In the end, there was only me, standing in a windswept churchyard, watching the coffins being lowered into the cold earth. That was when Lady Pemberton appeared. She was my mother's cousin, a woman I had met perhaps twice in my entire life. She had not attended either funeral, but she arrived at our final rented lodgings 3 days after my mother's burial, dressed in expensive black silk and wearing an expression of calculated sympathy. "My poor, poor child," she said, embracing me in a cloud of cloying perfume. "What a tragedy this all is. What a terrible, terrible tragedy." I did not trust her. Something in her eyes, in the way they darted around the room assessing the remaining furniture, in the slight curve of her thin lips, put me on my guard. But I was exhausted and grieving and utterly alone, and when she extended her gloved hand and offered me a home, I took it. I took it, and I stepped into a prison that would hold me for 5 long years. Lady Pemberton lived in a respectable townhouse in a respectable neighborhood, the kind of house that proclaimed solid middle-class prosperity without aspiring to aristocratic grandeur. Her husband had been a successful solicitor who left her comfortably provided for, and she had spent the years since his death positioning herself on the fringes of fashionable society, never quite belonging, but always hovering, always watching, always scheming. She had 2 daughters of her own, Cecilia and Marguerite, both of them several years older than me, and both of them unmarried despite their mother's relentless efforts. They were not unattractive. Cecilia had fine brown eyes, and Marguerite possessed a pretty figure. But there was a hardness about them, a petty meanness that showed in the curl of their lips and the sharpness of their eyes. They had their mother's calculating nature without her ability to conceal it, and potential suitors sensed the coldness beneath their practiced smiles. They resented me from the moment I crossed the threshold of their home. I was younger, more refined, better educated, and despite my fallen circumstances, I carried myself with the unconscious grace of someone who had been raised to expect respect. They saw me not as a cousin to be welcomed, but as a threat to be neutralized, and their mother, far from discouraging their cruelty, seemed to delight in it. Within a week of my arrival, the true nature of Lady Pemberton's charity became clear. I was given the attic room, the one with the cracked window and the sagging bed, and the drafts that whistled through the gaps in the floorboards. The room had clearly been used for storage before my arrival. Cobwebs still clung to the corners, and the single piece of furniture besides the bed, a rickety washstand with a chipped basin, had been covered in dust. The ceiling sloped so sharply that I could only stand upright in the center of the room, and the narrow window looked out on nothing but a brick wall. I was expected to rise before dawn to help the servants with the fires. I would stumble down the dark stairs in the freezing pre-dawn hours, my hands clumsy with cold, to lay the fires in the drawing room and the breakfast room and Lady Pemberton's chamber. The servants, a cook, a maid, and a manservant, were kind enough to me when Lady Pemberton was not watching, but they dared not show too much sympathy. Their positions were precarious, and they knew it. I mended the family's clothes, spending hours in the dim light of my attic room, squinting at tiny stitches while my fingers ached and my back screamed in protest. I ran errands in all weather, trudging through rain and snow to fetch ribbons and gloves and patent medicines, while Cecilia and Marguerite remained warm by the fire. I helped the cook with the meals, though I was never permitted to eat at the family table. I ate in the kitchen with the servants, though I was not considered one of them either. I existed in a liminal space, belonging nowhere, wanted by no one. The worst of it was not the work, nor the cold, nor even the endless small humiliations that Lady Pemberton devised for her own amusement. The worst of it was the way she spoke of me to others, using my presence as a prop in the theater of her own benevolence. "This is my poor cousin's daughter," she would say to her visitors, gesturing at me with a limp hand as I stood in whatever corner I had been banished to. Such a tragic case. Her father was the Earl of Whitmore, you know, quite respectable once. Though, of course, the family was completely ruined. No dowry, no connections, no prospects whatsoever. We do what we can, of course, out of Christian charity, but one cannot make a silk purse from a sow's ear. The visitors would cluck their tongues sympathetically, casting pitying glances in my direction, and Cecilia and Marguerite would exchange satisfied glances, and I would stand with my hands clasped and my heart burning and my pride screaming silently inside my chest. "You should be grateful," Lady Pemberton told me once, when I had dared to ask for a warmer blanket as winter approached. "Where would you be without my generosity? In the workhouse, that's where. In the gutter, on the streets. Instead, you have a roof over your head, food in your stomach, and the benefit of respectable society. The least you can do is show some appreciation." I thanked her, because that was what was expected of me. I kept my eyes lowered and my voice soft, because any sign of spirit was met with swift punishment. Reduced rations, extra duties, public humiliation before the servants. I learned to make myself small, invisible, to move through the house like a ghost, noticed only when something was needed. But at night, alone in my attic room, I allowed myself to remember who I was, who I had been, who I still was, beneath the layers of grief and humiliation. I was the daughter of the Earl of Whitmore. I was the girl who had saved a prince's life. I was the owner of the most magnificent necklace in England, hidden beneath a loose floorboard not 5 feet from where I lay shivering. And I knew something that Lady Pemberton, for all her cruelty, could never take from me. I knew about the sapphires. It happened when I was 12 years old, long before the fall, when my father still held his place at court and my mother still wore diamonds in her hair. The king had organized a hunting party at his country estate, and my father, being a favorite, had been invited to bring his family. I remember the excitement of that journey, the way my mother fussed over my dress and my hair, the way my father lifted me onto his horse and let me ride before him through the golden autumn woods. The royal estate was grander than anything I had ever seen, a vast palace of honey-colored stone set amid rolling parkland, with towers that seemed to touch the clouds and windows that blazed like fire in the setting sun. Servants in scarlet livery lined the drive as we arrived, and the sound of hunting horns echoed across the grounds. I was too young to participate in the hunt itself, of course. I was left in the care of a governess while my parents joined the riding party, and I spent the morning exploring the palace gardens, marveling at the marble statues and the ornate fountains and the roses that bloomed in impossible profusion despite the autumn chill. The accident occurred on the second day. I had wandered away from the main party, bored by the adult conversations and drawn by the sight of a deer drinking from a stream at the edge of the forest. It was a beautiful creature, its coat a rich russet brown, its eyes dark and liquid and wary. I moved toward it slowly, hardly daring to breathe, wanting to get closer without frightening it away. The deer bolted, of course, they always do, and I followed it without thinking, drawn deeper into the forest by some instinct I could not name. The trees closed around me, their branches interweaving overhead until the sunlight faded to a dim green glow. I walked for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, until I realized with a start that I had no idea where I was. That was when I heard the shouts. They were distant at first, muffled by the trees, but as I moved toward them, they grew clearer. Someone was calling for help. Someone was in trouble. I found him at the bottom of a shallow ravine, his body crumpled against a fallen log, his face white with pain and fear. The young prince, Edward he was called, the king's only son and heir, had become separated from his guards during the hunt. His horse had stumbled on a hidden root and thrown him, and he had tumbled down the steep slope, unable to stop himself, until he landed in a heap at the bottom. His leg was twisted beneath him at an unnatural angle, and blood seeped from a gash on his forehead. He was trying to call for help, but the fall had knocked the breath from his lungs, and his voice came out as little more than a whisper. I did not panic. I do not know why, but some instinct kept me calm. Perhaps it was the memory of my father's voice, teaching me what to do if someone was injured during a hunt. Perhaps it was the look in the prince's eyes, desperate and frightened, and somehow very young despite his 14 years. Perhaps it was simply that there was no one else, and someone had to act. I climbed down to him carefully, testing each foothold before I put my weight on it. He watched me approach with wide eyes, his lips moving soundlessly. It is all right, I told him, keeping my voice steady and calm. I am going to help you. Do not try to move. Who are you? He managed to ask, his voice cracking. My name is Eleanor, I said. My father is the Earl of Whitmore. He is part of the hunting party. Can you tell me your name? He almost smiled at that. I am Edward, he said, the Prince of Wales, and I rather think I have broken my leg. I looked at the twisted limb and winced in sympathy. I think you may be right, I said, but we must keep you still until help arrives. Here, I began tearing strips from my petticoat, the fine white cotton ripping easily. Let me bind it so it does not move. He hissed in pain as I worked, but he did not cry out, and I found myself admiring his courage. The binding was crude, but it would serve. I used more strips to press against the wound on his forehead, stanching the flow of blood. You are very capable, he observed, watching me with something like wonder. Most girls would be screaming by now. Most girls have not been taught by an earl who loves hunting, I replied. My father always said that everyone should know how to deal with emergencies in the field. Your father sounds like a wise man. He is, I said, and I felt a surge of fierce love for my father, for his patience and his kindness and his endless willingness to teach me things that most people thought unsuitable for young ladies. I stayed with the prince for what felt like hours, though it was probably less than one. I talked to him constantly, keeping him awake, keeping him calm, distracting him from the pain. I told him about my home, about my mother's roses and my father's library and the secret passages I had discovered in our old house. He told me about his life in the palace, about the endless lessons and formal dinners and the crushing weight of expectation that came with being heir to the throne. I envy you, he confessed at one point, his voice drowsy with pain and exhaustion. You can be anything you want. You can marry for love and live wherever you choose and do whatever makes you happy. I will never have that freedom. Everyone has constraints, I said, even earls' daughters. We are expected to marry well and behave properly and never, ever do anything interesting. He laughed at that, a weak sound that ended in a groan of pain. You are doing something interesting now, he pointed out. I suppose I am, I agreed, though I expect I shall be in tremendous trouble when they find us. My governess will have fits. The search party found us shortly after that, drawn by the prince's horse, which had wandered back to the main group without its rider. I heard the shouts and the crashing of branches, and then there were men scrambling down into the ravine, their faces white with terror, their hands reaching for the prince. The king was among them. I will never forget the expression on his face when he saw his son lying there, injured and helpless. The naked fear, the desperate love, the overwhelming relief when he realized that Edward was alive. He gathered the boy into his arms and held him as though he might never let go, and the prince, despite his injured leg, despite his dignity, despite his 14 years, clung to his father and wept. And when the king finally looked up, his eyes found mine. "You," he said, "you stayed with him." I curtsied, because that was what I had been taught to do, and I murmured something about being glad the prince was safe. But the king was not satisfied with murmurs and curtsies. He wanted to know everything: how I had found his son, what I had done to help him, why I had stayed when most children would have run for help and left the injured boy alone. I told him the truth. I told him about the deer in the forest and the shouts I had heard. I told him about the binding I had made and the wound I had stanched and the conversation I had kept up to prevent the prince from falling unconscious. I told him that I had simply done what my father had taught me, nothing more. The king listened without interrupting, and when I finished, his eyes were wet. "You saved my son's life," he said. His voice was rough with emotion. "The physician says that if he had been left alone much longer, if the bleeding had continued, if he had lost consciousness in that cold ravine, he might not have survived. You saved him. You, a child of 12, with nothing but your wits and your courage and your petticoat." I did not know what to say. The magnitude of what had happened was only beginning to dawn on me. I had helped the prince. I had saved the heir to the throne. The future King of England owed me his life. The king summoned me to his private chambers the next day. My parents came with me, nervous and proud in equal measure. My mother had dressed me in my finest gown and spent an hour arranging my hair, and my father had briefed me on proper protocol until my head spun with curtsies and titles and formal addresses. We stood before the monarch in a room hung with tapestries depicting scenes from England's glorious past and lit by 100 candles. The king sat in a chair that was not quite a throne but close enough, and beside him stood the prince, his injured leg splinted and wrapped, supported by a crutch but determined to be present. "I owe you a debt," the king said to me, his eyes grave and kind. "A debt I can never fully repay. But I wish to give you something, child, a token of my gratitude, a promise." He opened a velvet box, and inside lay the most beautiful necklace I had ever seen. Sapphires the color of midnight, each one the size of my thumbnail, surrounded by diamonds that blazed like stars against the dark blue. All of it was set in delicate gold filigree that seemed almost too fine to be real, too exquisite to exist outside of dreams. I learned later that it had belonged to his grandmother, Queen Charlotte, and had been commissioned by King George III as a birthday gift. It was one of the crown's most treasured pieces, kept in a vault and rarely displayed. It had not been worn in public for 50 years. "This is yours now," the king said, placing the box in my trembling hands. "And more than this, I give you my word. If ever you need protection, if ever you need help, you have only to send word to me. The crown will stand beside you, Eleanor Ashworth. Always." I thanked him. I curtsied again and again. My mother wept, and my father beamed with pride. And the prince caught my eye and smiled. A real smile, warm and grateful. The smile of a friend. We returned home with a treasure that I did not fully understand. I wore the necklace once for a portrait that was commissioned to commemorate the occasion. The painter came to Whitmore Hall and set up his easel in the music room, and I sat for hours in my best dress while he captured my likeness. In the finished painting, the sapphires blazed against my white neck, and my eyes, gray like my mother's, looked out at the viewer with an expression that the painter called dignity beyond her years. That portrait hangs now in some creditor's house, sold along with everything else. But the sapphires themselves, those I kept. My mother hid them for me on the night the creditors came, pressing the velvet box into my hands with fierce, desperate urgency. "Guard these," she whispered. "Tell no one." And I had guarded them. Through 5 years of servitude in Lady Pemberton's house, through cold nights and hungry days and endless humiliations, I had kept my secret hidden. I had never told anyone about the sapphires. I had never even looked at them, except on the darkest nights, when the cold was unbearable and the loneliness threatened to swallow me whole. On those nights, I would pry up the loose floorboard in my attic room and take out the velvet box. I would open it just a crack, letting the faint candlelight catch the stones, watching them glimmer like hope in the darkness. And I would remember. I would remember my father's voice, warm and patient, teaching me to bind a wound. I would remember my mother's hands, soft and gentle, arranging my hair. I would remember the king's eyes, grave and grateful, promising me protection. I would remember that I had once been someone, that I had once been worthy of a king's gratitude, and then I would close the box and hide it away again, and I would return to my narrow bed and my thin blanket and my cold, lonely existence. Because the time was not right, because I was not ready, because I did not yet know how to use what I had been given, until the night of the Duke of Ravenswood's winter ball. The invitation arrived on a grey November morning, delivered by a livered footman whose presence in Lady Pemberton's modest neighborhood caused a sensation among the neighbors. I heard the commotion from the kitchen, where I was helping cook prepare the morning tea, and I slipped into the hallway to see what was happening. Lady Pemberton stood in the entrance hall, holding the heavy cream envelope as though it were made of gold. Her face was flushed with triumph, her eyes bright with an almost feverish excitement. Cecilia and Marguerite hovered beside her, craning their necks to see the elegant script on the card inside. "The Duke of Ravenswood's Winter Ball," Lady Pemberton breathed. "The most exclusive event of the season, and we have been invited." I knew of the Duke, of course. Everyone knew of the Duke of Ravenswood. He was one of the wealthiest men in England, the owner of vast estates in the north and a magnificent townhouse in London. He was also one of the most mysterious, a man who had withdrawn from society after the death of his young wife 3 years ago, and who rarely appeared in public. His winter ball was legendary. It was held once a year, in the week before Christmas, and invitations were coveted more than jewels. To be included on the Duke's guest list was to be marked as someone of significance, someone worth knowing, someone who mattered. Lady Pemberton had been angling for an invitation for years. She had cultivated connections, dropped hints, maneuvered and schemed with the single-minded determination that characterized everything she did. And now, at last, her efforts had been rewarded. "This is our chance," she announced at dinner that evening, waving the invitation like a battle flag. The silverware caught the candlelight as she gestured, scattering reflected light across the walls. "Cecilia, Marguerite, this is the night you will secure your futures. The Duke is unmarried, wealthy beyond measure, and in need of a wife. He has no heir, no close family, no one to inherit his fortune. One of you," her eyes glittered with calculation, "will catch his eye. One of you will become a duchess." Cecilia and Marguerite exchanged excited glances, already mentally designing their gowns, planning their strategies, imagining themselves mistress of the Duke's grand estates. I sat in my usual place at the far end of the table, eating my thin soup in silence. I had learned long ago that invisibility was my best defense in this house. If I kept my head down and my mouth shut, I might escape the evening without being humiliated. But Lady Pemberton was not finished with me. "Eleanor," she said, and the sweetness in her voice made my skin prickle with warning. "I do hope you understand that you will not be accompanying us." I had expected nothing else. I had not allowed myself to imagine, even for a moment, that I might be included. But still, something in my chest tightened. Still, some small, foolish part of me had hoped. "Of course, Lady Pemberton," I murmured. "I understand." She smiled, and it was the smile of a cat with a mouse beneath its paw. "Do you? I wonder. You see, I would not want you to harbor any foolish hopes. A girl in your position, with no jewels, no dress, no connections whatsoever, you would be a laughingstock, an embarrassment. She paused, letting the words sink in. You would shame this family simply by appearing. Cecilia smirked into her wineglass. Marguerite tittered, a high, unpleasant sound. I have no intention of attending, I said, keeping my voice steady with an effort that cost me dearly. Good. Lady Pemberton's smile widened, satisfied by my submission. Then you will stay here and ensure that the house is properly prepared for our return. We shall be very late, I expect. The Duke's entertainments always continue until dawn. I expect a fire in my chambers when I return, hot water for washing, and a light supper laid out. Is that clear? Yes, Lady Pemberton. She nodded, pleased, and returned her attention to her daughters. They began discussing fabrics and hairstyles, debating the merits of silk versus velvet, arguing over who would wear the family's pearls. I was forgotten, as I always was, the moment I ceased to be useful or entertaining. But that night, alone in my attic room, something shifted inside me. I sat on my narrow bed, my thin blanket wrapped around my shoulders against the cold, and I stared at the loose floorboard in the corner. The moon was full, casting silver light through my cracked window, and the house was silent except for the distant sound of the wind. I thought about the years I had spent in this house. 5 years. 5 years of being treated as less than human, of being reminded every day that I was worthless, of having my dignity stripped away piece by piece until I could barely remember what it felt like to be respected. I thought about my parents, lying in their cold graves, unable to protect me anymore. I thought about the king's promise. If ever you need protection, if ever you need help, you have only to send word to me. The crown will stand beside you, Eleanor Ashworth, always. And I thought about my mother's voice, fierce and urgent in the darkness of our last night together. They are your proof that you were loved, that you mattered. I had hidden for so long. I had kept my head down and my mouth shut and my pride locked away in a velvet box beneath the floor. I had told myself that survival was enough, that endurance was victory, that someday, somehow, things would change. But they would not change, not unless I changed them. I knelt on the cold floor and pried up the loose floorboard. The velvet box was there, where it had always been, wrapped in a piece of cloth to protect it from dust and damp. I lifted it out and held it in my hands, feeling its weight, its significance, its promise. I opened the box. The sapphires caught the moonlight streaming through my cracked window, and for a moment they seemed to glow with a light of their own. They blazed like captured stars, like frozen fire, like hope made visible. I touched them gently, tracing the cold facets of the stones, feeling the smooth perfection of their cut. I will go, I whispered to the empty room, and the words felt like a vow. I will go to the ball. The preparations took every ounce of cunning I possessed. I had no money for a new dress, but I remembered that my mother's things had been packed into a trunk and sent with me to Lady Pemberton's house. Lady Pemberton had allowed me to keep the trunk out of a rare moment of what she called compassion, but which I suspected was simply indifference. It had been shoved into a corner of the attic and forgotten, covered with old curtains and broken furniture, invisible to anyone who did not know to look for it. I found it on the first night of my preparations, after the household had gone to bed. I crept through the dark attic with a single candle, moving aside the accumulated detritus of years until I reached the familiar shape of my mother's trunk. The leather was cracked and faded, the brass fittings tarnished. But when I lifted the lid, the scent of lavender rose up to meet me. My mother's scent, the scent of home, of safety, of love. I pressed my hand to my mouth to stifle a sob, overwhelmed by the sudden rush of memory. I could see her so clearly, sitting at her dressing table, laughing at something my father had said, turning to smile at me with her beautiful gray eyes. I could hear her voice, soft and musical, reading me stories before bed. I could feel her arms around me, holding me close, keeping the darkness at bay. "I miss you," I whispered into the silence. "I miss you so much." But I could not afford to grieve. Not now. Not when I had work to do. I searched through the trunk, setting aside chemises and stockings and the small personal items my mother had treasured. Most of her dresses were too old-fashioned to wear. Styles from a decade past, with wide skirts and elaborate trim that would mark me immediately as behind the times. But at the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper as carefully as if it were made of gold, I found the gown she had worn to her last ball. It was pale blue silk, the color of a winter sky just before dawn. The style was simple, a modest neckline, sleeves that ended just below the elbow, a skirt that fell in elegant lines without excessive fullness. Delicate pearl buttons ran down the back, and a subtle pattern of flowers had been woven into the fabric, visible only when the light caught it just right. It was old, yes, but it was beautiful, and more importantly, it was my mother's. I tried it on that night, standing before the small spotted mirror that hung on my wall. The dress fit as though it had been made for me. My mother and I had been the same height, the same build, the same in so many ways. When I looked at my reflection, I saw her looking back at me. We had the same dark hair, the same gray eyes, the same determined set to our chins. We had the same way of holding ourselves, straight and proud, as though daring the world to challenge us. For a moment, I was not Eleanor the poor relation, the charity case, the girl with no prospects. I was Eleanor Ashworth, daughter of an earl, worthy of respect and admiration. I spent the next several days in secret preparation. I mended a small tear in the hem, working by candlelight after the household had gone to bed. I cleaned and pressed the fabric until it gleamed. I practiced arranging my hair in a simple but elegant style, using pins I had salvaged from Lady Pemberton's discarded accessories. I polished the pearl buttons until they shone like tiny moons, and I waited. The night of the ball arrived with a mixture of dread and anticipation that made me feel almost sick. I went about my duties as usual, laying fires, running errands, enduring the casual cruelties that Lady Pemberton and her daughters dispensed without thought or mercy. But beneath my calm exterior, my heart was racing. Could I really do this? Could I really walk into the most exclusive ball of the season, alone and uninvited, wearing nothing but my mother's old dress and a necklace that half of London would recognize? Yes, I told myself. Yes, I can. I must. The preparations for Lady Pemberton and her daughters took hours. The house was in chaos from midday onward. Maids rushing up and down stairs with hot water and curling irons, the dressmaker arriving for last-minute adjustments, arguments erupting over which ribbons to wear and how to style their hair. I made myself useful, fetching and carrying, staying out of the way when tempers flared, counting the hours until they would finally leave. At last, as the winter sun began to set, they were ready. Lady Pemberton swept down the stairs in a gown of burgundy velvet, her thinning hair elaborately dressed and ornamented with feathers. Cecilia followed in pale pink silk that did nothing for her complexion, and Marguerite in yellow satin that made her look sallow. They climbed into the waiting carriage with much rustling of skirts and arranging of trains, and I stood at the door to see them off. "Remember your instructions?" Lady Pemberton said, fixing me with a cold stare through the carriage window. "I expect everything to be ready when we return." "Yes, Lady Pemberton," I said. "Have a pleasant evening." The carriage pulled away, and I stood watching until it disappeared around the corner. Then I turned and went back inside, and I began to transform. The servants had been given the evening off, a rare gesture of generosity that I suspected had more to do with Lady Pemberton not wanting anyone to see how late she returned than with any actual kindness. The house was empty and silent as I climbed the stairs to my attic room, my heart pounding in my chest. I undressed quickly, shivering in the cold, and poured water from my pitcher into the basin to wash. The water was freezing, but I barely noticed. I was too focused on what lay ahead, too consumed by a mixture of terror and exhilaration that made my hands tremble as I reached for my mother's dress. The silk slid over my skin like cool water, settling into place as though it had been waiting for this moment. I fastened the pearl buttons with difficulty. They ran down the back, and I had no maid to help me, but eventually I managed. I arranged my hair the way I had practiced, pinning it up in a simple style that left my neck bare. I pinched my cheeks to bring color to my face and bit my lips to redden them. And then I opened the velvet box. The sapphires were cold against my skin as I clasped the necklace around my throat. They settled heavily on my collarbone, a tangible reminder of everything I was risking, everything I was claiming, everything I was determined to prove. I looked at myself in the mirror, and I did not see a poor relation. I did not see a charity case. I did not see a girl with no prospects and no future. I saw the daughter of the Earl of Whitmore. I saw a woman who had survived loss and cruelty and despair. I saw someone who deserved to walk into a ballroom with her head held high. I saw myself. For the first time in 5 years, I truly saw myself. I wrapped myself in my mother's old cloak, a dark wool garment that had seen better days, but would keep me warm on the walk ahead, and I pulled the hood low over my face. The sapphires were hidden beneath the cloak, invisible to anyone who might glance my way. I looked like nothing more than a servant girl on an errand, unremarkable, unworthy of notice. I slipped out of the house and into the cold December night. Getting to the Duke's estate was no small feat. I had no carriage, no horse, and no money for a hired cab. The estate was 3 miles from Lady Pemberton's house, a distance that would be nothing on a pleasant summer day, but felt enormous on a freezing winter night. But I had no choice. I could not afford to hire transportation, and I could not risk being seen by anyone who might recognize me. So I walked. The streets were mostly empty at this hour, the respectable citizens of London already departed for their evening entertainments. I kept to the shadows, moving quickly, my thin shoes providing little protection against the cold cobblestones. My breath formed clouds in the air, and my fingers, despite being tucked inside my cloak, grew numb within minutes. But I did not feel the discomfort. I felt only the wild, reckless beating of my heart, the rush of blood in my veins, the fierce and desperate hope that had been building inside me for 5 long years. I will not be invisible tonight, I told myself with each step. I will not be forgotten. I will not be ashamed. The streets grew wider and more elegant as I approached the fashionable district where the Duke's London townhouse was located. Gas lamps cast pools of golden light on the pavement, and the houses rose around me like cliffs of pale stone, their windows blazing with the warmth I did not possess. Carriages passed me in a steady stream, their occupants hidden behind frosted glass, heading toward the same destination I sought. And then I saw it. The Duke of Ravenswood's townhouse rose before me like something from a fairy tale, its windows blazing with light, carriages lined up along the drive, music floating through the crisp winter air. It was enormous, 5 stories of pale Portland stone, with columns flanking the entrance and balconies wreathed in winter greenery. Every window was lit, and through them I could see the glitter of chandeliers, the movement of elegantly dressed figures, the shimmer of silk and jewels. I paused at the edge of the grounds, suddenly aware of how mad this was, how reckless, how potentially disastrous. If Lady Pemberton saw me, there would be consequences, terrible consequences. She would throw me out of her house. I was certain of it. She would tell everyone I was a thief, a liar, an impostor. She would destroy whatever shred of reputation I had left. And even if Lady Pemberton did not see me, what then? I had no invitation. I had no sponsor. I had nothing but my mother's old dress and a necklace that, for all I knew, no one would believe was legitimately mine. I could be turned away at the door, humiliated before the cream of London society. I could be arrested for theft, dragged away in disgrace, thrown into prison. I could lose everything. Not that I had much left to lose. But then I touched the sapphires at my throat, feeling their cool weight through the fabric of my cloak, and I thought of the king's promise. I thought of my mother's fierce whisper. I thought of all the nights I had spent shivering in that attic room, dreaming of a moment exactly like this one. What was the worst that could happen? They could turn me away. They could humiliate me. They could call me names and spread rumors and make my life even more difficult than it already was. But they could not take my dignity. They could not take my courage. They could not take the truth of who I was. I straightened my spine, lifted my chin, and walked forward. The footman at the door looked at me with barely concealed surprise as I handed him my cloak. A young woman, arriving alone, without escort or introduction. It was highly irregular. His gaze swept over me, taking in my simple dress, my unadorned hair, the absence of the usual accompaniments that marked a lady of quality. But then his eyes fell on the sapphires at my throat, and I watched his expression change. Surprise became confusion, then wonder, then something approaching awe. He knew, as anyone with even a passing familiarity with court history would know, that he was looking at a piece of legendary significance. "Your name, miss?" he asked, his tone considerably more respectful than it had been a moment before. I drew myself up to my full height and spoke clearly, projecting my voice with a confidence I did not entirely feel. "Miss Eleanor Ashworth," I said, "daughter of the late Earl of Whitmore." He bowed, an actual bow, deep and formal, the kind reserved for persons of genuine importance, and stepped aside. "Welcome to Ravenswood House, Miss Ashworth." And I entered the Duke of Ravenswood's ballroom. The first thing I noticed was the heat. After the bitter cold of my walk, the warmth of the ballroom felt almost overwhelming, wrapping around me like a physical embrace. Fires blazed in enormous hearths at either end of the room, and hundreds of candles glittered in chandeliers that hung from a ceiling painted with scenes of classical mythology, gods and goddesses, nymphs and satyrs, all frozen in attitudes of eternal celebration. The second thing I noticed was the light. It was everywhere, bouncing off crystal and gold and silver, reflecting from the polished floor and the gleaming surfaces of mirrors that lined the walls. The room seemed to shimmer and glow, as though it existed in a different realm from the cold, dark world outside. The third thing I noticed was the silence. It started near the doorway, where the guests closest to me caught sight of my entrance. One by one, their conversations faltered. One by one, their heads turned. One by one, their eyes fixed upon me, upon my face, upon my dress, upon the blaze of blue and white at my throat. The silence spread outward like ripples in a pond, moving through the crowd in a wave of arrested motion. Dancers stopped mid-step. Musicians faltered, their bows trailing off into discord. Servants paused with trays suspended in midair, their mouths hanging open. Within moments, every eye in that glittering room was fixed upon me. I had expected attention. I had not expected this absolute breathless stillness, as though time itself had stopped. And then I heard the whispers. "Is that? Surely not. It cannot be." The sapphires, Lady Worthington gasped somewhere to my left, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Good God, look at the sapphires. Is she wearing the Queen Charlotte necklace?" another voice demanded. "That is impossible. It has been locked in the royal vault for decades. Who is she?" A man's voice, rough with curiosity. "I have never seen her before." The whispers grew, swelling into a buzz of speculation and disbelief. I heard my father's name mentioned, then my mother's. I heard guesses about who I might be, where I had come from, how I could possibly have obtained such a treasure. And then I heard another voice, familiar and hateful, cutting through the noise with a shrillness born of pure panic. "It cannot be," Lady Pemberton said. Her voice was loud enough to carry across the room, and I saw her pushing through the crowd toward me, her face the color of curdled cream. That girl, she is my house guest, a charity case, a penniless orphan with no connections whatsoever. She cannot possibly. She stopped, her eyes fixed on the sapphires at my throat. I watched the color drain from her face as recognition dawned, as she understood what she was seeing. "Those jewels," she whispered. "Where did you get those jewels?" "They were a gift," I said, and my voice rang out clear and steady across the silent ballroom. "A gift from His Majesty the King, given to me when I was 12 years old, in gratitude for saving the life of his son." The murmurs exploded into full-throated conversation. I heard exclamations of astonishment, demands for clarification, voices raised in argument and speculation. Lady Pemberton's face went from white to red, her eyes blazing with fury. "She is lying," she hissed, turning to address the crowd. "She must be. This girl is a nobody, a charity case. She has been living in my house for 5 years, working as little better than a servant. She could not possibly. Is there a problem here?" The voice was deep and calm, cutting through the chaos with an authority that silenced every other speaker instantly. The crowd parted, and a man stepped forward into the cleared space around me. I knew him at once, though we had never met. The Duke of Ravenswood, Alexander Blackwood, the host of this glittering event, the master of this magnificent house, the man whose wealth and position made him one of the most powerful figures in English society. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in immaculate black evening clothes that emphasized the sharp angles of his face and the startling blue of his eyes. His hair was dark, nearly as dark as mine, and there was something forbidding about the set of his mouth, something cold and remote that made me think of marble statues in empty halls. His reputation preceded him, the aloof aristocrat, the grieving widower, the man who had not smiled in public since his young wife's death 3 years ago. He was said to be cold, unapproachable, uninterested in the social world that surrounded him. He hosted this ball out of obligation, people said, not pleasure. And now he stood before me, his expression utterly unreadable, his eyes moving from my face to the sapphires at my throat and back again. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "I do not believe I have had the pleasure." I curtsied, grateful for the ritual that gave me something to do with my trembling hands. "Your Grace." He did not return the pleasantry. Instead, he continued to study me with an intensity that made my skin prickle, his gaze penetrating, assessing, revealing nothing of his own thoughts. "That is a remarkable piece of jewelry," he observed. "It was a gift," I repeated, "from His Majesty the King." "So you have said." His tone was neutral, neither believing nor disbelieving. "And what service did you render to earn such a gift?" I met his eyes directly, refusing to be intimidated. "I saved his son's life," I said simply, "when I was 12 years old. The prince was thrown from his horse during a hunting party, and I found him injured at the bottom of a ravine. I stayed with him, bound his wounds, and kept him conscious until help arrived." The murmurs rose again, and I heard the doubt in the assembled voices, the skepticism, the assumption that I must be lying. A girl with no fortune, no family, no position. How could she possibly possess a gift from the king himself? How could she possibly have saved the life of the heir to the throne? Lady Pemberton seized her opportunity. "She is delusional," she announced loudly, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "The poor dear. Her mind has never been quite right since the tragedy with her parents. The loss unhinged her. She has been prone to fantasies, to delusions of grandeur. I do apologize for this embarrassment, Your Grace." She turned to fix me with a glare of pure hatred. "I shall take her home at once." She reached for my arm, her fingers closing around it with bruising force, and something inside me snapped. 5 years. 5 years of enduring her cruelty, her contempt, her endless campaigns to make me feel worthless. 5 years of keeping my head down, my voice soft, my pride hidden. 5 years of waiting for things to change while she stripped away everything that made me who I was. No more. I turned to face her, and I did not lower my eyes. "Remove your hand," I said, and my voice rang out clear and cold across the ballroom. "You have no claim on me, Lady Pemberton. You are not my guardian. You are not my family. You are merely a woman who took me in when I had nowhere else to go, and who has spent 5 years making me pay for that charity with every ounce of dignity I possessed." Lady Pemberton's face went slack with shock. Around us, I heard gasps of astonishment, murmurs of scandal and delight. No one had ever spoken to Lady Pemberton like this, least of all the meek, silent girl who lived in her attic. But I was not finished. "You housed me in an attic room that was not fit for habitation," I continued, my voice steady and clear. "You fed me scraps from your table. You dressed me in rags. You worked me like a servant and mocked me to your friends. You told anyone who would listen that I was worthless, that I had no value, that I should be grateful for the crumbs you deigned to throw my way." "Eleanor," Lady Pemberton hissed, her eyes darting to the watching crowd. "How dare you?" "I dare because I am done," I said. "Done hiding, done pretending to be less than I am, done letting you and your daughters and everyone like you convince me that I have no value." I reached up and touched the sapphires at my throat. "I am the daughter of the Earl of Whitmore," I said. "I am the protégé of the King of England, and I will not be spoken to as though I were nothing." The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Pemberton's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. Cecilia and Marguerite stood frozen beside her, their faces matching masks of horror. And the assembled guests watched with the avid attention of spectators at a particularly thrilling theatrical performance. I had done it. I had finally, after 5 years of silence, said what I had always wanted to say, and now I would face the consequences. But before Lady Pemberton could respond, before she could summon some new attack or devise some fresh humiliation, the Duke of Ravenswood did something that shocked everyone in the room, myself most of all. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice was quiet but carried clearly across the ballroom. "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" He extended his hand. I stared at it, too stunned to move. The Duke of Ravenswood did not dance. Everyone knew that. He had not danced since his wife's death, had not touched a woman in public for 3 years, had made it clear through his behavior that he wanted nothing to do with the social rituals that others found so essential. And now he was offering his hand to me, a nobody, a scandal, a girl who had just made a scene in the middle of his ballroom. His eyes met mine, and I saw something there. Not pity, not condescension, but something that might have been admiration, or recognition, or both. I took his hand. His fingers closed around mine, warm and strong and surprisingly gentle. He led me onto the dance floor, the crowd parting before us like waves before the prow of a ship. I was aware of every eye upon us, aware of the whispers swirling like autumn leaves, aware of Lady Pemberton's venomous glare following my every step. But more than all of that, I was aware of him, the Duke, Alexander, the man whose arm now encircled my waist, whose hand held mine with a firmness that felt both protective and possessive. The musicians struck up a waltz, and we began to move. I had been taught to dance, of course. It was part of every young lady's education. But I had not danced in years, not since before my father's ruin, and I was terrified that I would stumble, that I would embarrass myself, that I would prove to be exactly the graceless creature Lady Pemberton had always claimed I was. But dancing with Alexander was like breathing. Our bodies moved together naturally, effortlessly, as though we had practiced this 1,000 times before. He led me through the steps with quiet confidence, his hand warm against my back, his eyes never leaving my face. "You are either very brave or very foolish," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "I cannot decide which." "Perhaps both," I replied, surprising myself with my own boldness. It is difficult to survive 5 years with Lady Pemberton without developing a certain recklessness. A ghost of something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, but close. For a man renowned for his coldness, his expression was remarkably warm. "I have met Lady Pemberton," he said. "My sympathies." I did not know how to respond to that. I had expected distance from him, perhaps even contempt. I had not expected sympathy, and certainly not humor. We danced in silence for a moment, and I became aware of how naturally our bodies moved together, how perfectly matched our steps were, how easy it felt to be in his arms. It was strange, given that I barely knew him, given that I had no reason to feel comfortable with this severe, remote man. And yet I did. "You have not told me about the sapphires," he said at last. "How you came to possess them. The full story." So I told him. The words poured out of me as though I had been waiting years to speak them. And perhaps I had. I told him about the hunting party and the deer and the forest that swallowed me up. I told him about the frightened boy in the ravine, about the binding I had made from my petticoat, about the conversation I had kept up to prevent him from falling unconscious. I told him about the king's gratitude, about the ceremony in the tapestried chamber, about the velvet box and the promise. I told him about my mother's whispered instructions on the night we lost everything, about the loose floorboard in my attic room, about the years I had kept my secret hidden while Lady Pemberton stripped away every other piece of my identity. He listened without interrupting, his hand steady on my back, his steps never faltering. And when I finished, his jaw was tight and his eyes were dark with an emotion I could not name. "You kept them hidden all this time," he said. "You could have sold them. You could have bought your freedom." "I know," I said, "but they were not mine to sell. They were a gift and a promise. The king told me that if I ever needed protection, the crown would stand beside me. I did not want to squander that promise on mere survival. I wanted to save it for something that mattered. And this?" He gestured with his chin at the glittering ballroom, at the watching crowd, at the spectacle we had become. "This matters?" I looked at him steadily. "Yes," I said, "because I am done hiding. I am done pretending to be less than I am. I am done letting Lady Pemberton and her daughters and everyone like them convince me that I have no value. Tonight I remembered who I am, and no matter what happens tomorrow, no one can take that away from me." The music swelled to its final crescendo, and we stopped dancing. We stood there on the floor, facing each other, and I saw something shift in his expression, some barrier falling away. "You are remarkable," he said quietly, so quietly that I was certain no one else could hear. "Do you know that?" I did not know what to say. I did not know what to feel. I only knew that when I looked into his eyes, something inside me responded in a way I had never experienced before. The night continued, and I discovered that the Duke of Ravenswood was not the cold, unfeeling man the world believed him to be. He stayed by my side for hours, a silent but unmistakable declaration of support. He introduced me to other guests, using his considerable influence to ensure that I was treated with respect. He deflected impertinent questions with a skill that spoke of long practice, steering conversations away from dangerous waters and toward safer topics. We talked about everything and nothing: books we had read and loved, music that moved us, the way the snow looked falling over his estate in the north, the way the fog curled through London streets on autumn mornings. He told me about his childhood, about the vast house where he had grown up, about the mother who had died when he was young, and the father who had never recovered from the loss. And eventually, as the hour grew late and the crowd thinned, he told me about his wife. Her name was Arabella, he said. We were standing on a balcony overlooking the garden, the cold air a welcome relief after the heat of the ballroom. Our breath formed clouds between us, and the stars glittered overhead like a second set of chandeliers. "Arabella," I repeated. "That is a beautiful name. She was a beautiful woman." His voice was flat, controlled, but I could hear the pain beneath the careful words. The marriage was arranged by our families when we were both very young. I was 20, she was 18. We barely knew each other. I waited, sensing that he needed to tell this story, that it had been locked inside him for too long. She was fragile, he continued, delicate in body and spirit. She had been raised in a sheltered household, protected from anything that might cause her distress. When she came to live with me, she was completely unprepared for the reality of marriage, for the duties of running a great house, for the expectations of society. He paused, his jaw tightening. I tried to be patient with her. I tried to be kind, but I could not love her. I did not know her well enough to love her, and she was too frightened of me to let me know her better. She saw me as a stranger, an obligation, something to be endured rather than embraced. I am sorry, I said softly. That must have been lonely for both of you. He nodded. It was. She cried herself to sleep every night for the first year of our marriage. I could hear her through the walls, and there was nothing I could do. Nothing I said made any difference. Nothing I offered brought her comfort. He turned to look at me, and his eyes were dark with old grief. She died in childbirth, he said. The baby, a boy, died with her. The physician said she was too fragile, that her body was not strong enough to bear the strain. But I knew the truth. She died because she had given up, because she could not face the prospect of raising a child with a man she did not love. That was not your fault, I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Was it not? I married her knowing I could not give her what she needed. I fathered a child with her, knowing she was not strong enough to bear it. I watched her fade, day by day, and I did nothing to stop it. You could not have known, I said. You could not have predicted. I should have known. He cut me off, his voice harsh. I should have seen how unhappy she was. I should have released her from the marriage, found some way to set her free. Instead, I kept her trapped in a life that was killing her, because that was what was expected of me, because I was too proud and too stubborn to admit that I had made a mistake. He turned away, his shoulders rigid with tension. I have told myself 1,000 times that it was not my fault, he said, that I did what any man in my position would have done, that I treated her kindly, that I gave her everything she asked for, that I never raised my voice or my hand. But none of that matters. She died hating me. She died knowing I could not love her, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life. I reached out and touched his arm, a gesture that would have been scandalously forward under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances, and I sensed that he needed the contact, needed to know that he was not alone with his guilt. Love cannot be commanded, I said softly. It comes, or it does not. You cannot blame yourself for failing to feel something that was never within your power to choose. He looked down at my hand on his arm, then up at my face. His expression was raw, unguarded, stripped of the cold mask he wore for the rest of the world. I have told myself that 1,000 times, he repeated, but I never believed it, until tonight. The night ended, as all nights must, but something had changed between us. Some connection had been forged, some understanding reached, some possibility glimpsed on the far horizon. He handed me into a carriage when the ball ended, his carriage, driven by his servants, taking me back to Lady Pemberton's house because I could not bear the thought of walking those cold streets again. He held my hand a moment longer than necessary as he helped me inside, and his eyes met mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "May I call on you?" he asked. "Tomorrow?" I hesitated. Calling on me meant calling at Lady Pemberton's house, meant acknowledging our connection in a way that could not be easily dismissed, meant inviting all the scandal and speculation that would inevitably follow. "Yes," I said. "Yes, you may." He smiled then, a real smile, the first I had seen from him all evening, and it transformed his face entirely. The coldness melted away, replaced by warmth and hope, and something that looked almost like joy. "Until tomorrow, then," he said, "Miss Ashworth. Until tomorrow, Your Grace." The carriage pulled away, and I leaned back against the cushions, my heart racing, my mind whirling with everything that had happened. The ball, the confrontation with Lady Pemberton, the dance, the conversation on the balcony, and Alexander, the Duke, the man who had looked at me as though I were the most remarkable woman he had ever met. I did not know what the future held. I did not know if the connection between us could survive the scandal that was surely coming. I did not know if I could trust my own feelings, so newly awakened after years of dormancy. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had taken the first step, and whatever came next, I would face it with my head held high. The scandal broke within days. I had known it would come, of course. Lady Pemberton was not the sort of woman to accept humiliation quietly. She had been publicly challenged in front of everyone who mattered, and she would not rest until she had exacted her revenge. The rumors spread through London like plague. Eleanor Ashworth was a thief, they said, a liar, a fraud. She had stolen the sapphires from some poor, unsuspecting victim and worn them to the Duke's ball to trick her way into society. She was a fortune hunter, a seductress, a woman of loose morals who had bewitched the Duke with her feminine wiles. Worse still, Lady Pemberton claimed that I had been dismissed from her household for theft and impropriety. She produced a maid who swore, for a price, I was certain, that she had seen me sneaking out with the jewels. She wept to her friends about how I had repaid her kindness with betrayal. She painted herself as the victim, and me as the villain. And society, ever eager to believe the worst, accepted her version of events without question. Within a fortnight, my reputation was in tatters. The ladies who had smiled at me at the ball now turned their backs when I passed in the street. The gentlemen who had asked for introductions now pretended not to recognize my name. The invitations that had flooded in after my triumph at the ball, and there had been many, driven by curiosity if nothing else, dried up entirely. I was alone again, cast out again, except that this time I had nowhere to go. I had taken a room at a modest boarding house with the last of my mother's hidden coins, a few shillings that I had found sewn into the lining of her trunk. The room was small and cold and furnished with nothing but a narrow bed and a washstand, but it was mine. It was the first space I had occupied in 5 years that did not belong to Lady Pemberton, and that alone made it precious. I sat alone in the evenings, staring at the sapphires that had brought me such brief, glorious triumph, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. The blue stones glittered in the candlelight, beautiful and cold and utterly useless. I could not eat them. I could not wear them. I could not even sell them without inviting accusations of theft. They were proof. But proof of what? The word of a king given to a child 15 years ago? A promise that might have been forgotten or withdrawn or superseded by more pressing concerns? I had gambled everything on a moment of defiance, and I was beginning to fear that I had lost. And then Alexander came. He arrived on a cold afternoon in late January, stepping out of his carriage in front of my humble boarding house as though it were the most natural thing in the world for a duke to call upon a disgraced woman in such a place. I watched from my window as he approached the door, his face set in grim lines, and my heart began to pound. I had not seen him since the ball. He had called on me the day after, as he had promised, but Lady Pemberton had refused to let him see me. The next day, I had been turned out of her house entirely, and by the time I had found lodgings and sent word of my new address, the scandal had broken, and I had assumed, I had been certain, that he would want nothing more to do with me. But here he was. The landlady nearly fainted when she realized who was standing in her shabby parlor. She practically flew up the stairs to fetch me, her eyes wide with astonishment and her hands fluttering with nervous energy. "A duke, miss," she breathed. "A duke here, asking for you." "What shall I tell him?" "Tell him I will be down directly," I said, my voice surprisingly calm given the chaos of my emotions. I took a moment to compose myself, to smooth my hair and straighten my dress, my oldest dress, the one I had worn to do housework in Lady Pemberton's home because it was all I had left. I looked, I knew, nothing like the elegant woman who had walked into the Duke's ballroom wearing the king's sapphires. I looked like what I was, a penniless woman, alone and disgraced, with nothing to recommend her but her pride. But that pride straightened my spine as I descended the stairs to meet him. He was waiting by the fire, his greatcoat still dusted with snow, his gloves clutched in one hand. He turned when I entered, and I saw the strain on his face, the lines of tension around his eyes and mouth. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice was carefully controlled. "I apologize for not coming sooner. I did not know what to say." I stood in the doorway, my hands clasped in front of me, feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way I had not felt even when facing down Lady Pemberton. "Why have you come?" I asked finally. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, hoarse from days of disuse. "Because I have been a fool." He stepped closer, and I could see the self-recrimination in his eyes, the anger directed inward. "Because I allowed myself to be persuaded that it would be better to wait, to let the scandal die down, to avoid making things worse by appearing too interested in a woman the world was determined to destroy. And while I waited, while I deliberated, while I listened to advisers who cared more about my reputation than about justice, you suffered. I did not ask for your intervention," I said, and there was more bitterness in my tone than I had intended. "No." He moved closer still, close enough that I could see the pulse beating in his throat. "You did not ask. But I should have given it anyway. I should have stood beside you from the first moment the rumors began. I should have made it clear to everyone that I believed you, that I supported you, that anyone who spoke against you would answer to me." "Why?" I whispered. "Why should you care? You barely know me." He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Because in 20 years of moving through society, of attending balls and dinners and house parties beyond counting, I have never met anyone like you," he said. "Because you walked into my ballroom with nothing but your dignity and your courage and a necklace that proved you had been loved, and you faced down a woman who had tormented you for years without flinching. Because when we danced, I felt alive for the first time since Arabella died. Because when I look at you, I see someone who has known loss as I have known it, who has survived pain as I have survived it, and who refuses, absolutely refuses, to let that pain define her." He reached out and took my hand, and his touch sent fire racing through my veins. "I am here because I love you, Eleanor," he said. "I know it is too soon to say such things. I know we have only met once, that I have no right to your affection, that you may very well wish me to leave and never return. But I cannot stay silent any longer. I love you. And if you will let me, I will spend the rest of my life proving it." I stared at him, this proud, remote man who stood before me with his heart in his eyes, and I felt the last of my defenses crumble. "The scandal," I said weakly. "The rumors. If you align yourself with me publicly, you will be tainted by association. Your reputation, your position." "Hang my reputation," he said fiercely. "I do not care what society thinks of me. I have never cared. Let them whisper and gossip and speculate until they are hoarse. Let them turn their backs on us both. We will build a life that does not depend on their approval." "You cannot mean that," I said, even as hope began to flutter in my chest. "You are a duke. Your position requires— My position requires nothing except that I conduct myself with honor," he interrupted. "And there is no honor in abandoning the woman I love to face slander alone." He pulled something from his pocket, a folded paper sealed with wax. I recognized the royal crest, the lion and the unicorn, the symbols of a power greater than any duke. "I wrote to the king," he said. "I told him what had happened. I told him that you were being slandered, that your honor was being dragged through the mud, that a woman of your character and courage deserved better than to be destroyed by the lies of a petty, jealous relation." He placed the paper in my trembling hands. "This is his reply," he said. "Read it." My fingers shook as I broke the seal. The words blurred before my eyes, swimming in a haze of unshed tears, but gradually they came into focus. The king remembered me. He had never forgotten the girl who saved his son's life in the forest all those years ago. And when he learned what had been done to me, he was furious. His letter confirmed everything I had claimed about the sapphires, about my service to the crown prince, about the promise he had made to protect me. He condemned Lady Pemberton and all who had slandered me in the harshest possible terms. And he announced his intention to make a public statement acknowledging me as his protégé and demanding that society treat me with the respect I deserved. More than that, and here my hands began to shake so badly I could barely hold the paper, he offered me a position at court, a formal recognition of my status as a ward of the crown, a guarantee of protection that no one could challenge or ignore. Alexander watched my face as I read, and when I looked up, tears streaming down my cheeks, he smiled. A real smile, warm and bright and full of joy. "She cannot touch you now," he said. "Lady Pemberton, with all her schemes and lies, she is finished. No one can touch you now. I do not know who moved first." Perhaps it was both of us at once, drawn together by a force stronger than propriety or caution or fear. All I know is that one moment we were standing apart, and the next his arms were around me, holding me tight, and my face was buried in his chest, and I was weeping with relief, with joy, with the overwhelming realization that I was no longer alone. He held me for a long time, there in the shabby parlor of a boarding house, with the landlady undoubtedly listening at the keyhole and the snow falling softly outside the window. And when at last I lifted my head to look at him, he cupped my face in his hands and looked at me with an intensity that stole my breath. "Marry me," he said. "Not because you need protection or position or security, though I would give you all of those things gladly, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it, because you have awakened something in me that I thought was dead forever, because I love you, Eleanor. I love you with every broken, scarred, imperfect piece of my heart." I said yes. How could I say anything else? The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change and vindication. The king's statement was published in every newspaper in London, and the effect was immediate and devastating. Lady Pemberton, who had been so confident in her lies, found herself suddenly and utterly ruined. The maid who had testified against me confessed, under pressure, that she had been bribed. The friends who had believed Lady Pemberton's slander hastened to distance themselves from her, suddenly discovering urgent business elsewhere whenever she appeared. The doors that had once been open to her slammed shut, one after another, until she was as isolated as she had once tried to make me. Within a month, she and her daughters had fled London in disgrace. Their townhouse was sold to pay debts that had accumulated while Lady Pemberton was too busy scheming to manage her affairs. I never learned where they went. I never tried to find out. They had ceased to matter. I should have felt triumph. Instead, I felt only a strange, hollow relief. I had not wanted to destroy Lady Pemberton. I had only wanted to be free of her. But freedom, I was learning, comes in many forms. And the most precious form of all was the freedom to love and be loved in return. Alexander courted me properly, despite my protests that such formality was unnecessary. He brought me flowers and books, and small, thoughtful gifts that showed how closely he had listened during our conversations at the ball. He took me driving in the park, introducing me to his friends, the true ones who valued character over gossip, and showed me the ancestral home where I would soon be mistress. Ravenswood Hall was everything I had imagined and more. A vast estate in the north of England, surrounded by rolling hills and ancient forests, with a house that had grown over centuries from a medieval castle into an elegant manor. It had towers and turrets, formal gardens and wild woodlands, a library that contained more books than I could read in a lifetime. "This will be your home," Alexander said, standing beside me on the steps as I took in the view for the first time. if you want it." "I want it," I said. "I want all of it. The house and the lands and the libraries and the gardens. But most of all, I want you." He kissed me then, for the first time, standing on the steps of his ancestral home with the spring wind blowing through our hair. It was a gentle kiss, almost reverent, the kiss of a man who had found something precious and was afraid of breaking it. I kissed him back, and I was not afraid at all. The wedding was held in late spring, on a day when the sun shone bright and warm, and the gardens of Ravenswood Hall were full of flowers. I wore a gown of white silk, simple but elegant, and around my neck I wore the sapphires that had started everything. The king himself attended, old and frail but still commanding, leaning on the arm of his son, Prince Edward, the boy I had saved in the forest, now a man of 27. He kissed my cheek when he saw me, and he whispered in my ear, "You saved my life once," he said, "and now you have saved yourself. I always knew you had courage." I wept then, standing at the altar beside the man I loved, thinking of my mother and father and how much I wished they could see me. But perhaps they could. Perhaps somewhere, beyond the veil that separates this world from the next, they were watching and smiling and knowing that their daughter had found her way home. The years that followed were the happiest of my life. Alexander, who the world believed to be cold and unfeeling, proved to be the most tender and devoted of husbands. He anticipated my needs before I could voice them, listened to my opinions as though they mattered, held me through the dark nights when memories of the past still haunted me. He told me he loved me every day, not out of habit or obligation, but out of genuine, overflowing feeling. We had children, 3 of them, 2 boys and a girl, and watching Alexander with them erased any lingering doubt I might have had about his capacity for love. He was patient and playful and fiercely protective, teaching our sons to ride and our daughter to read, building snow forts in winter and chasing fireflies in summer. The household echoed with laughter and noise and the kind of chaos that only a family can create. Our eldest son, Edward, named for the prince whose life I had saved, had his father's dark hair and my gray eyes. He was serious and thoughtful, with a sense of responsibility that would one day make him an excellent duke. Our second son, James, was all mischief and laughter, always climbing trees or exploring forbidden corners of the estate. And our daughter, Catherine, named for my mother, was the image of me as a child, with the same dark curls and the same determined chin. I became, in time, a force in London society, not because I craved influence, but because influence allowed me to help others. I established a charity for gentlewomen who had fallen on hard times, providing them with respectable employment and support. Too many women I knew found themselves in circumstances similar to mine, orphaned, impoverished, at the mercy of relatives who saw them as burdens or servants. I wanted to offer them an alternative. I wanted to give them the chance to rebuild their lives with dignity. I sponsored young artists and musicians, remembering how my mother had loved beauty in all its forms. I advocated for laws that would protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. I used my position to speak out against the kind of cruelty that Lady Pemberton had inflicted on me, and slowly, gradually, I began to see change. And through it all, Alexander stood beside me, my partner, my champion, my love. We grew old together, as I had always hoped we would. Our hair turned gray and our steps slowed. Our children grew up and married and had children of their own. But our love never faded. It deepened, strengthened, became the foundation on which our entire lives were built. We sat by the fire in the evenings, hands intertwined, talking about everything and nothing, just as we had on the night we first met. We watched our grandchildren play in the gardens of Ravenswood Hall, delighting in their youth and energy, spoiling them shamelessly with sweets and stories. On our 40th anniversary, Alexander gave me a ring, a sapphire, to match the necklace that had brought us together. He slipped it on my finger with hands that trembled slightly with age, and his eyes were as blue and intense as they had been on the night he asked me to dance. "You saved me," he said softly. "That night at the ball, when you walked in wearing those sapphires and faced down everyone who had wronged you. You saved me from a life of loneliness and regret. You showed me that it was possible to love again, to hope again, to believe that happiness was not just a story told to children." I lifted my hand to his cheek, feeling the familiar lines of his face beneath my fingertips. "We saved each other," I said. "That is what love does. It saves us from ourselves." He kissed me then, as he had kissed me 1,000 times before, and I thought of the girl I had been on that long-ago winter night. The girl who had nothing but a borrowed dress and a secret necklace and the desperate courage to claim what was rightfully hers. She would never have believed it. She would never have dared to dream that she would end up here, in this warm and beautiful home, surrounded by family and friends and a love so deep it defied description. But that is the thing about dreams. Sometimes they come true. Sometimes they come true in ways we never expected, through pain and struggle and the slow, hard work of building something beautiful from the ruins of something broken. I'm an old woman now, writing these words by candlelight as the snow falls outside my window. Alexander sleeps beside me, his breathing slow and peaceful, his hand still reaching for mine even in dreams. Through the window, I can see the stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet, like the jewels that changed my life so many years ago. I still have the sapphires. They sit in their velvet box on my dressing table, worn only on special occasions now, but never forgotten. My daughter will inherit them one day, and after her, my granddaughter. They will pass down through generations of women who will know their story, who will know that a girl once saved a prince and received a gift and kept it hidden for years, waiting for the moment when she would need it most. They will know that dignity is not something that can be given or taken away by others. It lives inside us, indestructible, waiting to be claimed. They will know that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That the bravest thing anyone can do is to stand up and say, "This is who I am. This is what I deserve, and I will not accept anything less." They will know that love, true love, is worth any price, any sacrifice, any risk. That it can heal old wounds and create new joys. That it can transform strangers into family and turn houses into homes. They said I had no jewels for the ball. They were wrong. I had jewels beyond measure. I had my mother's dress and my father's name. I had the king's gratitude and the duke's devotion. I had the memories of everyone who had loved me and believed in me and wanted me to succeed. Most of all, I had my own stubborn, unbreakable will. The will to survive. The will to hope. The will to walk into a ballroom full of people who expected me to fail and prove them wrong. That will was my greatest jewel, and it is the one I hope to pass on to my daughters and granddaughters and all the women who come after them. Because the world will always have Lady Pembertons. It will always have people who try to diminish us, to silence us, to convince us that we are worth less than we are. But we do not have to believe them. We do not have to accept their judgment. We can stand up, stand tall, and remind them, and ourselves, of the truth. We are worthy. We are valuable. We deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. And if anyone tries to tell us otherwise, we can look them in the eye and say what I said to Lady Pemberton all those years ago. I am done hiding. I am done pretending to be less than I am. I will not be spoken to as though I were nothing, because we are not nothing. We are everything. We are the sum of everyone who has loved us and believed in us. We are the hopes and dreams of our mothers and grandmothers. We are the future our children will inherit. We are jewels, each and every one of us, and we deserve to shine. In the end, that is all any of us really have. The rest is just ornamentation, glittering distractions from the only truth that matters. Love is the jewel that outshines all others. Love is the gift that lasts forever. Love is the legacy we leave behind when we are gone, burning bright in the hearts of those who remember us. I know this now. I have always known it, I think, even in the darkest days of my exile, even when I shivered alone in that cold attic room. Some part of me refused to surrender, refused to give up, refused to believe that my story was over. And that refusal, that stubborn, defiant refusal, was its own kind of jewel, a diamond forged in pressure and heat, waiting for the moment when it would finally catch the light. I am Eleanor Ashworth Blackwood, Duchess of Ravenswood. I am the daughter of an earl and the wife of a duke and the mother of 3 beautiful children. I am a survivor of loss and betrayal and despair. I am a woman who walked into a ballroom with nothing but her courage and walked out with everything she had ever wanted. They said I had no jewels for the ball. But when I entered wearing the king's gift, I proved them wrong. And I have never stopped proving them wrong every single day for the rest of my extraordinary, blessed, and beautiful life.